Welcome to the Battery Testing Mentor podcast, the podcast about battery testing, battery safety, battery handling, all topics that the battery tester is concerned. My name is Johannes, and we are talking here about these topics every 2 weeks. And I'm happy you are tuning in. In the last weeks, we had a couple of interviews, so I thought it's time to do again such an one-on-one session with you, just with me sharing some insights that I had in the recent months or topics that I worked on. In case you have any additional feedback, questions, or also new topics you would like to hear about, then just reach out to me on the typical channels like LinkedIn, the website, YouTube. And there is also still this option, as always, that you get the summaries into your email inbox. So just sign up there on www.batterytestingmentor.com in this email newsletter, or just drop me a message and ask me to add you there. Yeah, what are we talking about today? I thought I bring with me the topic of environmental testing. Environmental testing, I had some projects recently about this, and I mean, it's also coming up regularly in terms of the, when I do another business case or help a lab set up their test facilities, there's always this topic environmental testing, and kind of the thing is, all the other areas are very specifically described and it's very easy to grasp. And like abuse testing is when battery burns, performance lifetime testing is when you discharge it. But then this environmental testing is kind of a wide range of different tests. And very simply speaking, it is just simulating the external influences on the battery, the environmental influences, whatever can kind of impact the battery, impact the housing, that can be tested in these environmental testing setups. The very obvious thing is, of course, humidity, temperatures, like going up and down with the temperature, increasing humidity, decreasing humidity. I mean, the question is really, where's the risk to the battery? And there's definitely the higher humidity risk, very high temperatures, very low temperatures, especially in combination with the charging, discharging. But then there are more things like pressure changes, especially like if you say you go on, I mean, the one very common example, we talked about it as well, is the UN38.3 testing with the altitude test to simulate if it's transported in very high altitudes or put into the airplane. But there are also other aspects in regards to altitude that might need to be considered. For example, if you drive your car and it's very wet and then you go across a mountain pass and you have then, of course, the pressure equalization and kind of pressure goes out of the battery via this equalizer. And when you go down, then the pressure increases. So kind of air goes through this pressure equalizer inside the battery. Yeah, you want to, for example, make sure this works well, and maybe also that kind of not really too much humidity is sucked in, or at what point you really get problems inside the battery. Very often talked about is the IP testing. This is really something that we can dedicate a separate episode to. Like IP testing is how well is the battery protected against water ingress and particle ingress. There are corrosive tests like salt spray, but also other chemicals that are where the battery is exposed to, and then the goal is to see what really happens with the battery. And this can, basically there are no limits to imagination. Whatever you want to test, you can test. I mean, I once heard the example from airlines that test in their seats, and they have like a list of 90 different fluids that are poured over the seats to see if they can survive this. There was one one story from my former colleagues. They said they once had to buy a quite expensive whiskey and pour it over the seat to make sure the seat is, not too dirty afterwards or can be cleaned. But yeah, I mean, this is not happening in the battery area. In batteries, it's really more technical, more the aspect of kind of what can happen to the battery. And that is, of course, another thing to consider. Where do you put the battery up? Like, is it an electric vehicle battery? Is it a stationary battery? Is it a battery in a construction vehicle where you have like a lot of dirt around? Is it a water cooled battery or an air cooled battery? Stuff like this. Like, what can really happen to the battery? And to test then these environmental influences, that is really then the next point, to set up the test properly. Like, you want to really have a repeatable test. As always, you want it to be really reliable, that the outcome is telling you something that helps you in the development, and also that makes the lifetime of the battery really accessible. There is also a thing about environmental testing that is often discussed, or kind of where the question is mechanical testing part of environmental testing, or is it a separate area? Basically, mechanical testing means mainly the vibration shock, like mechanical inputs. You could say it's also an external input, and therefore it's part of environmental testing. On the other hand, you can also say, mechanical, like vibration shock testing, is a separate area because it is kind of very different in terms of the test setups and especially also this test equipment. Now, I said there is no limit to what you want to test. What is also often tested are combinations of different tests, because like a simple, for example, temperature change from hot to cold might not lead to too much stress on the battery. But if you kind of combine it with water, for example, that you say you heat up the battery to like 40, 50 degrees, and then you dump it into ice water, you have a lot more stress on the battery housing. So basically, in this test, you heat up the battery. It kind of really takes in the heat. All the materials are taking on the heat, and of course, adjust their properties. And then you dump it into cold water. The coldness leads to the air inside the battery shrinking. So basically, you get a little bit of an under pressure. You might, I mean, the idea is, if then the sealings are not really well designed, it might lead to this cold water being sucked into the battery. And that would be, of course, very bad. Now, the question is, of course, is this now just some crazy idea from some people who have nothing to do, and therefore they come up to combine it? And that is not the case. Like, the background for this test, for example, is really when you have a car parked in a garage that is like underground, for example, and it's normally always 20 degrees, 15, 20, 25 degrees. And then you drive out, it's winter, it's wet, it is snowy, like you basically go out of the garage, and right when you enter the street, you get into a big puddle of cold, dirty water. And then you basically have such an water shock, temperature shock. It's maybe a little bit more extreme in the testing environment, but we are testing to see really the edge cases. And there are many more of these combined tests where you bring different areas, different aspects together to really make sure the battery is doing well under all these circumstances. This environmental testing is also an aspect that goes a little bit into the lifetime testing, because these environmental influences are typically not super strong, and only about several repetitions you can really notice the environmental influences. And also, like when you do this cold water shock test, for example, it's not that you do one shock and then you will see if everything is okay or something is bad, But normally you really do a cycle process and you do it over and over again. And then the battery still might look completely normal, and then you open it and then you see maybe some traces of the water inside. And that is already kind of the alarm signal, because you don't want to have water accumulating there. Might lead to very, very bad results. This is then also where environmental testing goes more into abuse testing. When you say, okay, now let's continue and see what happens if the water stays inside the battery, and you put more and more water in, basically. Another question that is also asked is it enough to do the environmental testing just with the housing? Kind of not have the battery inside the battery case, but just do the housing, because in the end you want to just check if the outside influences kind of are well protected away from the battery by the case. Yeah, what to say? You can do it, of course, but the question is really how representative is this? Like normally, if you have a empty battery case, you have then a lot of air inside. When you have a battery inside, there is only a little bit of air gaps there. So especially like when we stayed in this water shock test, if you have everything filled with air, the air cools down much faster and kind of really changes the volume, and you get an quite high negative pressure inside the battery case. Whereas if you have the batteries filled in, like, and all the cells and everything, then the air volume that is there is much lower. And therefore the effect of this under pressure is also lower. Also, you have to consider like the whole temperature behavior. I mean, the battery is a huge pile of metal in different forms. Like inside the cells, you have metal, you have houses that are often made of metal, like the cases of the cell. You have structural elements, the case of the battery pack is made of metal. So it's like a lot of metal, and metal is a very powerful heat container, basically. You need to heat it up for a long time to make it warm. And that influences, of course, the whole behavior in these tests where temperature plays a role. So, of course, you can speed up the test by not having the cells and then have less weight, and therefore less of an heat sink in the test. But it is also a change in the behavior. And it is really important to consider then very in-depth what are the effects of this kind of missing additional heat sink. Yeah, I see we are now already at our 15-minute mark that I normally wanted to hold to not make it too long. Is there anything, I'm just thinking, anything very important about environmental testing? Maybe the key point is really you have a lot of different effects. It really depends how you use the battery, in which environment, what can impact the battery, and then really make a smart testing that tells you all the effects that you have. And of course, the testing must be well documented and well measured and so on. But that is clear. The important thing here in this episode is really all the different aspects that can go into the battery and influence the battery behavior. With that, I close this episode. I'm looking forward for the next episode in 2 weeks. I have another topic. Maybe if the kind of approval is fast enough, then we might have an interview already. We will see. Stay tuned, and I wish you a happy next 2 weeks.